So thank you, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Randy Bean. I'm delighted to have with us today Bajaj, Chief Data Officer from USAA, Tracy Daniels, Chief Data Officer from Truist, Gopal, Chief Data and Analytics Officer from Eli Lilly, Wendy Harrington, Chief Data and AI Officer from TIAA, and Kirsten Moody, Chief Data Officer from Prudential. In past years, we've had panelists, including CDOs from American Express, Cigna, CVS Health, MasterCard, Morgan Stanley, GE General Motors, Walmart, among others. Before we begin, I want to share some findings from an annual survey that we conduct each year of Chief Data Officers and other C executives. This survey is conducted of leading blue chip firms, so approximately 85 blue chip firms participated this year, including leading companies in financial services, healthcare and life sciences, and consumer, retail, and other industries. And many of the respondents are represented on today's panel. The predominance of the respondents were from financial services, with a significant number of respondents from healthcare and life science, as well as additional industries. And 76% of the responders were either chief data officers or chief data and analytics officers, and the rest of the respondents, the majority of which were other C executives. As you'll see from these slides, when we first conducted the survey in 2012, only 12% of the firms that we surveyed had appointed a chief data officer. And by 2021, in this year's survey, it was nearly 2/3. When we asked about who had primary responsibility for data within the organization, about half of the organizations reported that that responsibility lay with the chief data and analytics officer, and about half reported that it lay with other points within the organization. Interestingly, about a quarter of firms indicated that there was no single point of accountability. We also asked questions about the profile of a successful chief data officer, and we really found that there were several criteria that firms often looked at for individuals in the chief data officer role. One, which was the most prevalent in this year's survey, close to 50%, was organizations looking for an external change agent, an outsider who would bring in fresh perspectives and outside the four walls perspective to the organization. About a quarter of firms were looking for a company veteran, an insider who knew how to get things done within the organization and brought that perspective to bear. A significant number of organizations looked for a line of business executive who had been a proven leader and it generated business results. And then a small percentage identified either a data scientist, an analytics leader, or somebody who was a technology executive. When we asked firms whether CDO had revenue responsibility, even though there's been much discussion of monetization in recent years, it's still a very small number, roughly 13%, indicating that CDOs had any revenue responsibility, and the vast majority that they didn't. And when we asked about the long-term role of the CDO, where it should sit in the organization, it was about evenly divided, with half of executives saying that the CDO should sit on the executive committee, should be a tier 1 executive, and about half saying that the CDO should be a tier 2 executive reporting into the executive committee. We also asked questions about the focus of the role and whether it was more on offensive revenue generation type of activities and business building, or defensive regulatory and compliance activities. And we saw a sharp uptick this year, which we'll ask the panelists about, in terms of CDOs moving into more of an offensive and revenue generation role. Lastly, we asked about the success of the CDO role within organizations. As we saw previously, it's a role that's largely existed for the better part of the decade, with a majority of firms only adding the role in more recent years. So it's a very much a nascent role. And when we asked organizations about the success of the role, about a third responded that it had become well established in their organizations, and the other 2/3 indicated that it continued to be nascent and evolving. And a number of firms pointed out that they were continuing to struggle with turnover in the role. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to welcome our panelists. So hello, everyone. Nice to see you today. Sorry it couldn't be in person, but it's great to get representation from across the United States and across industries. So I'd like to begin, and we'll start one at a time, but how did you personally come to assume the Chief Data Officer role at your company? And I see that Tracy Daniels is to my immediate right on my screen, so we'll start with Tracy.
Yeah, thanks. So, I wish I could say it was incredible, professional planning. I've had a lot of exposure to data in the past as part of an organization that had stood it up at one of my prior companies, 15, almost 20 years ago, around really starting to mature the role of data within a fairly large financial institution. My most recent role, I actually started with the company to run automation and workflow and had data added as actually part of the responsibility. And if you think about it, we sort of made the case that we were doing all of the shared services, the things that were sort of fundamental to what was required to support applications as part of that role. And then it grew to be just its own specialty as we moved into this merger. So lots of different roles that had data in it as a general technologist, and then really the focus as we became Truist to really sharpen the acumen on data for the organization.
Excellent. And, and the question that we had posed before about which background do you come from, would you put yourself in the company insider background, or are you the outsider, or all of the above?
So I'm the newbie, right? I joined, my tenure with the company is only about 3 years, but data experience, but I'm more the technology person, but having led large operations, infrastructure, change organizations, a pretty deep background in what I consider to be like a fundamental shared service.
Excellent, thank you, and welcome. Ramnik, you've just changed roles. It was probably about 6 or 8 weeks ago that I talked to somebody that I knew in industry, Brian Gibbons, who was with Bank of America, and he said to me, well, I'm starting next week as Chief Data Officer at Wells Fargo. And I said, well, how could that be? Because I was just in communications with Ramnik and he was in that role. And he said, well, Ramnik is now Chief Data Officer at USAA. So maybe in speaking to the question about how did you come to assume this role, maybe you could also speak to the question about turnover in the CDO role.
Thank you, Randy, and good to be here with all of you. So yeah, I'm fairly recent in my new role as Chief Data Analytics Officer here at USAA, just about to hit my 90-day mark, which is a significant milestone. But my journey to get to CDO roles, I guess that I would say started post-banking crisis. Prior to that, I grew up in technology, building out technology platforms for financial services. But post-banking crisis, you couldn't get away from data. Very much focused on risk management, credit counterparty risk, and so forth, but then pivoting into, as the regulations evolved, into Basel and then more advanced techniques for risk management. And from then on, it was one thing led to the other, very much focused on not just capturing and gathering the right data and building reporting, analytic, and warehouse solutions, but also having the right governance over it so that it could be relied upon by the organization and the internal, external stakeholders. And that's kind of my journey to the CDO role. Lot of transformational initiatives along the way. I think for pretty much every industry, the data journey has been a lot about transforming the data environments. And then now that we are somewhat on the other side of that curve to start to really exploit the data environments that have gotten built out over the years. I think, yeah, the CDO role, as you pointed out, at least in the last decade, has still been nascent, evolving. I think organizations have been very much adjusting their expectations from what even a CDO should do or should be mandated to do, and certainly creates some amount of churn but also, quite frankly, a lot of opportunity, right? There's, as companies are recognizing the importance, the value, the opportunity, for all of us as data practitioners, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and certainly I'm excited to be in the role I'm in.
I did have one follow-up question for you, and that is, in recent years, it's been my experience, as you mentioned, that Wells Fargo's been a little bit focused more on the defensive. And it's interesting because Charles Thomas, who was on this panel a few years ago in his capacity at General Motors, he came from USAA, where he was very much focused on the offensive side, and came to Wells Fargo when it was shifting to the defensive side. So with you going to USAA, is your role going to be a little bit more on the offense?
So for us here, it's I would describe it as a good balance. I think a lot of the defense steps have been taken by my predecessors, and a lot of those foundations have been laid. There's certainly more work to do in getting more efficient with how we do the defense, and improving the environment around that. But as one of your I guess highlights is where the data and analytics roles are combined into a leadership position. We have done that at USAA. So we've combined the chief data and chief analytics role into my role. And there's a lot of energy and opportunity for us to bring the best and highest experience that we can to our membership. And certainly some of that takes form of marketing and revenue generation, but equally the experience that the members have, and also the products and our innovation around the core products that we can do on the basis of having strong data analytics and AI machine learning.
Excellent. Well, welcome. Shifting industry gears, welcome, Vipin. Coming from the life sciences, pharmaceutical industry. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to the Chief Data Officer role, and maybe how it's different than the financial services panelists that we have with us today?
Absolutely. And thank you, Randy, for having me on the famed Randy Bean panel at MIT CDOIQ. I've been a big fan of this panel for many years. So as far as my journey is concerned, I've been in this data analytics space for the past 25 years, ever since I graduated with my PhD from Carnegie Mellon. Has had data analytics leadership roles at 4 Fortune 100 companies in different industries prior to taking the role at Lilly. And prior to Lilly, I was with 2 large health insurance companies, and during those roles, I really realized the potential of data and analytics in healthcare as a whole. Like other industries, and perhaps even more, there is a greater runway in healthcare to create value and potentially transform moving into the future. So I took on this role as Lilly's first chief data and analytics officer. And again, Randy, as you mentioned, it's a fascinating space and fascinating area with respect to really driving transformation. And transformations are never easy, but personally, that's something that I enjoy doing, really bringing as a firm believer in the potential of advanced analytics and data, really bringing that transformational mindset to the organization to think about what are the potential and how do we realize that potential within organizations.
Excellent. Well, welcome, and thank you for the kind words. Wendy Harrington and Kirsten will be in waiting. And both of you are fairly new to your role. So maybe, Wendy, you could tell us about how you came to your role, and maybe a little bit about what excites you about your mandate. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I know you've been in your role now for, I guess, about, is it 2 years now, Kirsten?
No, it's 13 months. So June of 2020, June 15th at 9 a.m.
Wow, keeping track.
It's data. So my entire career has really had a theme of data and use of data in it. I've always been very interested in this nexus of people and technology, and how does an evolving kind of workforce skill set with evolving technology, come together in different ways to produce meaningful outcomes. My background training is actually in economics, and so going into the workforce, was very interested in this, as I said, this nexus between people and technology. And data has had an increasingly important role in transformation initiatives inside of companies. So, for me, I think the breadcrumb trail of my career took me increasingly in the direction of data and the use of data or analytics within the business. So I am the Chief Data Officer here at Prudential Financial. I am the inaugural Chief Data Officer and was brought in to actually build out the department. So I joke that I was employee number 1 of the Chief Data Office here at Pru. And we now have sort of a fully scaled and functioning department. Prior to that was the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at State Farm, where I was also the inaugural CDAO at State Farm, brought in to, again, build out the department and the capability for the company. And it's really around business transformation. And I think data and analytics are increasingly vital toolkits in that process of delivering strategic business outcomes. So it's really been not a straight path, but in retrospect, maybe straighter than it would have seemed at the time to get into the role.
Excellent. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
And congratulations on 13 months.
Thank you.
And Wendy, do you have audio now?
I think so. Can you hear me, Randy?
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Apologies for that. Well, Randy, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my quick background, all in the intersection of technology and finance, 12 years in consulting, say another 4 as chief operating officer, 10 as chief marketing officer, and a mix of startups and big companies. So in hindsight, you could say my entire career was actually training for the CDO job. And really why I joined TIAA originally was to lead NewVantage Labs, which is an innovative group that leverages big data, analytics, and AI to help the investment teams strengthen their performance. And as part of that journey, we started to talk more and more about the data challenges and opportunities as an organization. And so last September, we combined the different data organizations across the enterprise and created this Chief Data and AI Officer role.
Excellent. Well, welcome. So let me, because we have such a large panel, I'm going to jump to some of perhaps maybe the more provocative questions and throw them out there. A number of organizations have struggled with the Chief Data Officer role. Ramnik, your previous organization, Wells Fargo, I believe, had 4 or 5 people in the Chief Data Officer role. I know at some of the other major banks and financial services firms, they're on their 3rd, 4th, or 5th iteration of individuals holding that role. So what do you think makes it that some companies struggle with making the CDO role successful? And that's really open for anyone.
Yeah, happy to start us off, Randy. I think if I think of it as in 2 categories, I would say the first is just inherent in the kind of work that we do and the nature of data and how companies are set up. It's data is everywhere. Pretty much every process either generates or uses data, usually both. It's akin to, I call it, it's akin to raindrops, right? It's falling everywhere. And to have an accountable executive take charge of these raindrops falling everywhere before it's had a chance to collect into a river or a pond or a stream that's the challenge. Is there's a concept that somehow the chief data officer should be able to control all the aspects of where data is captured, generated, transformed, even before it gets accumulated. And then it's the inherent complexity of that role, and not having control over all of those aspects of the organization makes it challenging. The other category, which is more how the role is set up and how organizations are set up, data is simultaneously a very intuitive subject and a very complicated subject. So most people think they get data. Data is everyone's business, but then conversely, everyone thinks they're in the business of data. And so everyone's got their hands in it. Organizationally, there isn't really a clear mandate. There isn't really a clear definition, description of what this job is, unlike some of the other C-suite and even the executive tier 2 positions that have a fairly well-defined mandate. So I think that certainly is contributing to the challenges that organizations have had. And one that I often say is no one likes taxes. And for large part, at least in the last decade, the data team and the CDO have felt like a tax that businesses have to pay, because why do we need to do this work that you're asking us to do? Well, it's for the larger good, but the larger good is a tax, and nobody likes it. So that would be at least my sense for why it has been a struggle.
I'm going to have to remember that one. Data equals taxes. Would anybody else like to weigh in on that question? Don't be shy.
Hey, it's Tracy. We all do. I think part of it is also tying it to value, to Ramnik's point, right? Everybody can say that they're managing it, owning it, or driving value on behalf of it. So that clear delineation doesn't necessarily always fall with the data executive, which makes it sometimes difficult to understand the value of that role vis-a-vis another role. So it'd be kind of interesting, I think, even with Wendy, your role in really driving a business that is focused on deriving value directly from data, how your organization maybe wraps their mind around it. For us, I think that's the pivot that we're helping our teammates make, that if we work together, we can show that clear delineation of value from data, and therefore make it easier, to maybe more palatable, Ramnik, to accept the tax, but also to partner, right, in the efforts that actually drive the value and the capabilities they're looking for.
No, I think you nailed it, Tracy. It's a team sport. Like, in the end, I think that's part of what makes it so hard. And so whether you're the coach or just one of the players on the team, you got to get all the groups together, right? You need cyber health and security. You need to align with the chief privacy officer on privacy, data sharing, retention, right? You got to work with the application teams on controlling the environment and tapping into the central data sources that you have and cleaning up what's not working. And then you have the business alignment, right? The data stewards and the ownership there. And so I think to the value creation, I kind of look at it in the two sides that Randy referred to. There's offense and defense. In defense, it's pretty clear whether it's the privacy regulation or other things, when data goes sideways, right? It gets people's attention because it creates issues for clients and employees, and the regulators know as well. And on the offense, there's just so much opportunity right now in terms of the value that you can create from new insights, from better outcomes and decision-making, and better client and associate experiences that you can deliver, leveraging analytics and AI too.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, Randy, for the last point Wendy made, it's a huge opportunity, and it certainly brought data and the CDO role into a better stature for being able to support that kind of value generation through analytics, AI, innovation. Conversely, though, there's a desire and for the businesses to want to control it and own it now that it's such a generator of value and it's so prominent, and it's a agenda for the board all the way down. There's certainly that question of, well, if analytics is going to be the revenue generation opportunity, growth opportunity across all the businesses, then do we really want to have the CDO or the CDAO do it on our behalf, or have the businesses drive it directly for themselves?
I would say that there are two things. One is lack of a common understanding of what a CDO does in an organization. So the evolving role of CDO, and it's been evolving and it'll continue to evolve. So what does a CDO does compared to a CFO? I would say the organization has a much better understanding of a CFO's role compared to a CDO, even though both of them are managing assets, dollars versus data. And the second thing is around organizational readiness. Is the organization ready to support the mandate of a typical CDO? And some of the things that Ramnik and Bendy mentioned, there is an aspect of cultural and organizational readiness that is needed for a CDO to be as effective as they could be. So I see organizations, Randy, your survey shows that many organizations, or maybe 50% or more, have CDOs. But we got to ask the question, are these organizations ready to have a CDO? And if not, what needs to be done to be ready from a cultural evolution point of view?
That's a very good point, because sometimes people often ask me where organizations are in their maturity in terms of their data initiatives. And I say that, really what I look for in an organization is their readiness to basically embrace data and to transform. And, that's really a key indicator of what lies ahead for an organization. Kirsten, did you have a perspective?
Yeah. So I just wanted to jump in and underscore everything that the other panelists have said. I think it's spot on. And speaking sort of directly from recent experience here at Prudential, being sort of the first, both in the role and the first employee of the department, it was a very interesting exercise of effectively being a new chess piece on the chessboard, and how does the organization need to work with you. So spent a lot of time in sort of providing the organization with clarity about the scoping of the role. Not only what it is, but very clearly what it isn't. And what is the operating model that we were putting in place? And based on that operating model, what were the mutual expectations of how we would work together, and what does success look like? And we took the tactic of a hub and spoke operating model, which I think is actually a very important component to think through the operating model for success of the role, where the hub teams are really looking after the data enablement for the organization. And the spoke teams are really working back and embedded within the business on the use of that data for differentiated business outcomes. So we play the offense, through the spoke teams, and we play the defense in many ways through the hub teams. And I think that has come together very nicely, because we're able to meet the different parts of the organization where they are in terms of their readiness. Some are more mature than others who are just starting to think about it. And we can very clearly show a tax rate reduction as we start to work in the hub on the data modernization and those types of techniques. So I think, as I've seen organizations struggle, it's because the scoping and the operating model, the key foundational, how do you play this piece in the chess game that we're in, is even if it's a little bit murky, it can cause a lot of questions and swirl as the team gets more into execution. So those were two non-negotiables in setting up the department, and I'm really glad I spent the time looking at them.
Excellent. Yeah, it's clearly an evolving role, and if you think back 25 years or so to when the CIO role first appeared in a lot of organizations, there was the old joke that they said CIO stood for career is over. So it's glad to see that everyone's being patient and contributing to the definition and evolution of the role. Which brings us to the question of culture. In the survey, we asked this binary question. We say, what is the biggest obstacles to success? Is it technology or is it culture? And consistently over the years, about 90% of the responses have said culture. So maybe I'd like to invite each of you to speak a little bit about what you see as the major cultural challenges and how in your role you can work to overcome them to be successful.
I can get us started again, Randy. So from my lens, I think it comes down to, do the leaders ask for data before accepting a hypothesis or a conclusion? And if they don't, then until we don't start doing that, no matter what is being presented, what's the data behind it, what is the analytic behind it? We have high attrition because of burnout. Well, what is the data behind it? What are you basing that on? Or we need to have compensation increase. Well, what's the data? So no matter what the question is at hand, if we, culturally, if we are ingrained in asking for the data behind it, I think that's where the whole cycle starts. Then it comes down to allowing enough time and resource to do all the analysis so that these conclusions can be based on data. I think an impatient leader will not get a data-oriented answer because it takes more time and more analysis before you can truly comb through the reams of data that it takes for some of the more complex decisions and questions at hand. And then it comes down to, well, if you're creating a data attribute, capturing new data, modifying data, are you exercising enough diligence, enough discipline so that you're doing that correctly, so that when it's used, it's appropriate, it's accurate, and so forth. And I think that third aspect needs to be ingrained in the culture of the organization to get things precise, to get things right, knowing that it's not for just that one immediate purpose that the data is being captured for today, but it'll get used so many times we don't even know for what as we move forward.
Anybody else like to weigh in on the cultural challenges? And
yeah, Randy, I think I fully agree with the notion that when it comes to the CDO, driving a data-driven culture in an organization is probably the #1 role of a CDO, right? I mean, there are lots of other things that we talk about the CDOs could do, but in my book, that should occupy the first spot in terms of the role definition. And why do I say that? I say that because if the CDOs don't do it, nobody else will. And if the CDOs don't do it, the company that the CDO is a part of will pay a big price, because then that company really misses out on a data-driven culture. And then the next question becomes, what does a data-driven culture look like, right? And I think that's an interesting topic to think about. And there are different dimensions to that in my point of view. You should be hearing, what does the data tell us as a question in every meeting that's happening in the company? And if that is a conscious way of running meetings in a given company, that's one way of really driving a data-driven culture in an organization. Because a lot of what we talk about culture is abstract, but there are certain things that we can do to drive that culture. The organization should treat data as an asset. Then investments in data becomes straightforward. It doesn't become a swimming upstream discussion. Leadership at all levels should act in a data-driven fashion. They're telling stories with data. They're making decisions with data. They're champions for data. They're asking for data. And those leadership behaviors are going to be important. I'm not talking about CDOs, but I'm talking about broader organizational leadership. And leadership who are proficient and champions of data, if those are the leaders who are moving ahead in their careers, that's a signal the organization is sending. So I think there are broad things the organization can do to drive a data-driven culture, but I do think the CDO has to be the catalyst for that. And driving that broader organizational change has to be a big part of the mandate for CDO. Because CDOs typically focus on data, focus on analytics, But my take would be there needs to be an increased focus in cultural change and cultural change initiatives. And one of the things that we're doing at Lilly is to upskill. It's a goal for us. Every single Lilly employee with some basic data and analytics skills. I mean, it's a large task for a company, 30,000 plus people. But again, I do think it is important because everybody has to think in a data-driven way, not just a department or a function, but the entire employee base. And the CDO really has to drive that.
Well, Vipin has taken the position that job one in his book of the CDO is to build a data culture, a data-driven culture. How would anybody like to, who hasn't spoken yet, weigh in on this perspective? And do you share that perspective, or do you have a different perspective relative to the mandate for the role?
So I think, yes, I share the perspective, and there's a very important seat at the table that the Chief Data Officer has, which is in the formulation of business strategy, and how we start to take as a bullet point or a chapter in the strategy of do something neat with data into having truly a data sort of infused business strategy where data and or data science, AI, ML isn't a component of, but the critical thinking of how the business is going to strategically manage itself is infused with that capability in all things. And I think that really starts to help set in motion the pulling of the cultural levers that take us into becoming a data-driven culture. So for example, in Prudential, in the automation of underwriting, where we were fewer than 10% of transactions were automated, we're now sort of knocking on the door of 70% kind of within a year. That is very much a business strategy that is fueled by data, and the cultural knock-on effect of that type of transformative scale of automation now kind of really takes us into, we have to retrain our people, we have to think about the talent, we have to think about the reports, we have to think about how as leaders and contributors, we really engage with the business differently, because it's fundamentally operating now in a data-driven way versus more of a manual SOP-driven way. So that seat at the table at business strategy, and then how strategy turns into execution, I think is a very important dimension to how sort of a data-driven culture is actually achieved. And to Wendy's point, it's a team sport. I'm a big baseball fan. It's a hard ticket to sell if there's only one player on the field. So the CDO is very much an important leader, a catalytic leader for this, but it is not exclusive, right? We're a player in a major league game here. And I think recognizing that also helps to really catalyze the culture to becoming more of a data-driven culture.
Right. Tracy, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I completely concur. We've actually spent the last 12 or 18 months doing a top-down and bottoms-up set of education. So we have very intentionally set about a series around educating our board, our EL, around data, around the possibilities of data, examples in our industries and other industries of what teams are doing with data. We spent a lot of time doing bottoms up, so bringing in AI, ML. We've talked about bias for everybody in the community, in all communities of data. So it's data scientists, data analysts, et cetera. And I think to Kirsten's point, you start to see the fruits of that labor, right? So now we're becoming much more oriented as a company, not as a group or a particular division around data, to the point where, it felt incredibly validating and exciting when your president and COO says, as we're going through strat planning, make sure, Tracy, your team should be working with the chief strategy officer, and I want to know how our businesses are activating their strategy based on data. How are they infusing and driving that strategy with data in mind? So not as an afterthought, not as just as an enabler, but truly looking to create new products, new services, new interactions based on data. So that's, I think, to Vipin's point, right? The point of our job is to unleash that possibility within the enterprise and let them use their subject matter expertise to help us really hone the capabilities that we need to deliver.
Wendy, did you want to weigh in?
I would just add to what's being said with the following thought, which is what's stopping companies today. And when I came in and started talking, and then the second one is we're not exactly sure what the art of the possible is, right? We hear what others are doing at a high level, but help us make it real. And so for us, it was part of that journey of, okay, what are you trying to do? Let's go fix and figure out what's wrong with the data. And then at the same time, you know, we started looking at what problems people were trying to solve and pulling in pilots, right? Startups or others who had already kind of cracked that nut and said, can we match you up? And that'll get your feet wet and give you that art of the possible in a practical way. And I think those two, combined with the educational components that Tracy and Vipin and Kirsten talked to, are super important.
Thank you. There's been several mentions of business value and business strategy. I'm just curious from an organizational perspective, if I could go to each one of you. Do you sit in the technology organization or the business organization, or how would you describe that in terms of your reporting relationship? I can remember over the years, there were many CDOs who reported to CIOs, and then there were even some CIOs that reported to Chief Marketing Officer in the case of Charles Schwab in the early days, and CFO in the case of JP Morgan for a number of years, and work with a number of organizations now that the CDO is a peer of the CIO, but I'd be curious where each of you report into. Maybe you could start with Tracy.
So I report to a CIO. And interestingly, I think to maybe it was Wendy's point about it being a team sport, I actually lead a data council that is co-chaired by our Chief Digital Officer and my boss, the CIO. And then sort of at my level, I also work with a shared service with my CISO and my infrastructure partner around shared architecture, shared strategies to actually be able to enable this stuff really quickly. So CIO, but a good 50% of my job and time, to Vipin's point, is actually spent facing off to analytics teams and leaders who don't actually report to me to help pull us sort of all in the same direction.
Right. And Kirsten, how about yourself?
Yeah. So I report to our kind of EVP and global CIO, who is a member of the management committee here at Prudential. So my peers in global technology are the CIOs, the CISO, and so forth. So, and I think that has worked very well, given that we are in many ways all incentivized to cooperate in terms of how a progressive, sort of strategically ambitious CIO roadmaps and strategies relate and augment and help the CDO strategy, the CTO strategies as well, and then how we support each other in that. So it's been, it's worked very well, and I think collectively we take a complete package in terms of how we work to the business to help enable that strategy.
Excellent. Wendy, how about yourself?
Yeah, I report to the head of client services and technology, who's a member of the executive committee. And similar to Tracy, we convened an enterprise data governance committee, which is made up of business and technology folks, which I co-chair with the head of privacy. So I think kind of similar, right, in the technology world, but as a super close partner to business.
Excellent. And Vipin?
Yeah, I report to the CIO, who reports to the CEO. And similar to some of the themes that we just heard, we also have an enterprise data council with leaders from across the company, business, and IT that I sponsor, and the CTO and CISO, and other leaders are my peers. So we work collectively as a team.
Great. And Ramnath?
Also, I said on the business side, I report to the CAO. In my prior role, I used to report to the CFO and then the CAO. In my current role, I have a IT data engineering team that does data solutions in my own organization, which is a new construct. And prior roles, the CIOs were my peers and partners to build out data solutions. Here, I have that team in my organization. But certainly, sitting on the business side, worrying really about the business of data more so than the underlying technology solutions. I think there's some merit to that. It does bring you one step closer to the business partners across the company. Completely aligned with my peers here on having the right councils and committees and panels and so forth, where you can get that kind of alignment. But I've seen the benefit of being on the business side here.
Well, clearly one size does not fit all, and that continues to be the case. We have time for one question from the questions that have come in, and so this is an interesting one. And Tracy, you mentioned before about the chief digital officer, and somebody quotes some Gartner prediction about the chief digital officer and the CDO. And they say, is the chief data officer a fleeting position that will be displaced by the chief digital officer, or one to mature as a steady C-level executive? Does anybody want to weigh in on that?
Well, I see those as very close collaboration, but fairly distinct roles. So I'd be surprised if that prediction came true. I think if I think of the legacy of a CDO, besides the value that gets created while they have the role and all the analytic AI use cases we bring to life, I think that's all paramount. It's how we fund ourselves and so forth. But I think the legacy of a CDO, the lasting legacy, is foundationally a data environment that is horizontal, that's future-proof, that's built out robustly enough to support use cases we are not even imagining today. And that I don't think a chief digital officer would undertake.
Well said.
Yeah, I think with the onset of AI and ML, the amount of engineering that this calls for, so that you can have analytics teams that just fly and collect the reins to end maybe where we started with Ramnath's analogy, is truly a separate role. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting is in my role, interested with some of the peers on the panel, I actually have governance as well. And so there is a little bit of setting the guardrails for folks, working with my chief privacy officer partners and my security partners to make sure that all of these things that we also do really safely. And so I do think that there's a certain independence of this role that, again, helps enable, but is different than maybe the remit of the chief digital officer.
I'm going to try to share my screen in the closing minutes for just a moment. Let's see if this works. Let's see. Just if anybody's interested in additional reading, have written a number of stories over the years and profiled a number of organizations in HBR and MIT and Forbes on the role of the chief data officer and what different organizations are doing. And I have accumulated my generation's worth of learning in a recent book that's coming out next month. And there's a lot of discussion about the role of the chief data officer. And so for those who are interested, I encourage you to take a look. And I guess in closing, I'd like to ask if each of you would share any parting wisdom for others in the CDO role and others looking to be successful or aspiring to be chief data officers.
Seems like I get to start, so I'll go again. I would say chart your own course. There isn't a template. There isn't, don't expect your leaders to know exactly what they need you to do or want you to do. Rather set your own course. Of course, make sure you educate your peers and your leaders on what it is that you're going to go about doing and then deliver on that.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would say to the team analogy, right? Focus on the outcome that together the team's going to go after and win together, because that's the easiest way to align an organization and get the job done.
Excellent.
I would say my thought for the current or aspiring CDOs would be bold. We talked about a lot of reasons, a lot of challenges that CDOs encounter, but stick with the vision, develop a vision, and execute on that vision, and that requires being bold in driving value for the organization. Transformations never come easy, but again, pursuing that vision and creating value with your partners in the organization. And being bold and not given to the challenges is what I would say a CDO should do.
Well, I like that because before you said in your book that the culture was the most important thing, but it sounds more like a manifesto than a book. And Tracy and Kirsten, which one of you would like to go and which one of you would like to have the final word?
I'll let Kirsten have the final word. She's super deep. I love to hear her perspective. I would maybe echo a little bit of what Vipin said. In my head, it was a little different. I like to be bold. I was thinking more be ruthless about creating business value. And just being really maniacal on, that proof and the outcome that you're trying to drive. So, I like experiments, but I like experiments that drive value and can scale.
Well put. Kirsten, you get the final word.
All right. Well, I have the privilege of building upon the final words of the panelists. So thank you, everybody, for those. So I would say be bold and be differentiating. Right? The boldness is to differentiate, and that is on the topic of talent. It's on the topic of data and how this lifeblood of the company flows and works, and it's competitively differentiating in its uses. So be bold and be differentiating in that boldness. So thank you so much.
Excellent. So I'd like to thank very much our panelists today, Ramnik, Tracy, Vipin, Wendy, Kirsten, and we've just about finished on time. I know if we go a minute over, we get the music and the hook. So looks like it's 4:29 Eastern time, and we wrapped up in the allotted time and overcame any technical obstacles to deliver a very substantive discussion. So I'd like to thank each of you very much for participating and joining a great tradition in the MIT Chief Data Officer panels. So thank you very much, everyone. It's much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.